gross margins are now wider than most of their clients. That is just crazy.
I have a running game I've been playing for the last couple of years. Where is the N2 wafer? Where are the N2 wafers coming from?
The next iPhone chip was already in production towards the end of Q4 2025. You might as well get producing early. Welcome to Supply Chain. I'm Tim Culpin of Culpium.
I'm John from Asianometry. Tim, you know what happened recently?
A lot of things happened recently.
But it happens to have something to do with chips. A big company recently reported earnings.
Yes, that's right. TSMC reported earnings. I was on the earnings call. But you know what? Before we get to that, at about the same time that TSMC reported record earnings, something even bigger happened.
What?
Allbirds, my favorite shoe brand, became a neocloud. And what I think is fascinating is you dodged the Allbirds bullets. So give us the rundown on that.
You mean the New Zealand wool-made bullet, right?
Right. Tell us about your near run-in with Allbirds.
This must have been like 10 plus years ago. But I used to live and used to work in San Francisco. And one of the things that I wanted to do was I was looking for a new job. I had this new job offer from Taiwan. And I started talking, but I ended up getting in touch with the people from Allbirds. And at that time, they were the hottest shoe wear company on the planet. They had this article that said the most comfortable shoe ever, a lot of hype. And I got to know the media, the paid media manager, the marketing manager, the growth, all those people pretty well. And I went to visit their really swank office, and it was in the heart of San Francisco.
Was it a loft?
It was a loft. Computers everywhere, very nice, huge, big converted warehouse, very Silicon Valley. This was the 2010s, so I would say, they didn't have real technology back then. They just had e-com. E-com they thought was a transformational business, and I considered working there, and we talked about it, and they said, "Look, we would love to have you, but you can't do it from Taiwan." And so my dilemma was that, do I want to go work at Allbirds, working on a shoe that I love, and I would wear all the time, or should I go to Taiwan and take a 80% pay cut, 70% pay cut? And in the end, I decided to go to Taiwan.
Taiwan won. So if you'd worked for Allbirds,
Yeah.
Asianometry would never have been born.
Yeah, Asianometry would have never been born.
But on the flip side, if Asianometry was never born, you would have stayed at Allbirds and you may have saved them. As a marketing guy, you could have reoriented their marketing. So it's really Asianometry versus Allbirds. Choose one.
Yeah.
Well, we got Asianometry. We no longer have Allbirds. I have a pair on my feet now. They may be my last pair, unfortunately. And that all happened at the same time as TSMC earnings. So that's our segue back to the topic of the day.
Setting aside the vastly more important fact that Allbirds is now doing AI, so it's the AI birds. TSMC is slightly less important on the AI semiconductor industry than AI birds. Was there anything that kind of jumped out at you about this slightly less important company?
Well, it was a record at like almost every level. Record revenue, record gross margin. They have gross margins of mid to high 60s now, which is crazy because hitting 50 a decade ago is considered to be very good. I mean, there are not many companies that manufacture something that can have a gross margin above 60%. Most companies above 60% are non-manufacturing companies like software or chip designers like NVIDIA. Their gross margins are now wider than most of their clients. That is just crazy. Two facts that I noticed was their ASP, the amount they sell per wafer, went up again to a record. It's been trending up for about 5 years. It did dip for a little while, but it's basically been trending up. And wafer shipments has been on the rise again. So it was record high wafer shipments for the quarter. And I think that's significant because one of the big complaints that people have about TSMC is they're not scaling up and they're not expanding it quickly enough. And I was like, well, that's weird. Everything's hot. And it's really because they were constrained. It's not that they weren't selling more. They couldn't sell anymore because they couldn't ship anymore.
Right.
But now that they are shipping more, you can see that they are getting to squeeze out some more capacity because it takes a couple of years to bring capacity online. So we are definitely seeing it trend in the direction that everybody would like, which is more wafers coming out of the fabs.
Why would people care about, TSMC? The interesting thing about Taiwan companies, right, is that they report earnings every month, right? So we kind of knew the revenue number going in. So what do people care about necessarily when they're listening to the Q1 earnings report?
Yeah, you're right. On earnings day, we knew what the revenue would be because we'd already calculated that a week before. The key one for this was net income. People don't care about that much. EPS matters because, that tells you how well they're doing. But what the industry is really looking at is gross margins to an extent. But the other one is just the forward look. What's going to happen next? Because the chip industry, especially at the manufacturing side, it's planned so far ahead that by the time you've wrapped up the previous quarter and told everyone what you've made, it's kind of already history anyway. And even the next 3 months are pretty much locked in. And so when TSMC comes out and gives their revenue forecast for the coming quarter, and they give it as a range, there's really not a lot of room to be outside of that range because it's booked. The wafers are already in production. They book the revenue at the time that the wafer leaves the factory or gets packaged and delivered to the client. So already 2/3 of the way down the revenue runway. The gross margin similarly. Gross margin can change according to costs such as power prices and chemical prices and things like that. And also does change according to the US dollar, Taiwan dollar exchange rate. But that's really just kind of a cosmetic thing, because the whole industry prices in US dollars, but they're Taiwanese companies, so they report in Taiwan dollars. So really the gross margin, the Forex issue is kind of a cosmetic thing. But the gross margin can go up if they shove a whole lot of hot lots through, which is when a client comes and says, I really need these urgently. And TSMC says, sure, it's going to cost you a lot more, like 50% more, 100% more, 30% more, whatever. And the client's like, fine, I'll pay it because I'm making $1,000 a chip or whatever, I'm willing to pay it. So you can get
those MacBook Neo 2s, right?
Right, or whatever Jensen Huang wants to make that month. But the other way that they can really squeeze out better gross margins, especially at the leading edge, is just better efficiencies. So better yields, better efficiencies. They can push more wafers through the pipeline. And as they're ramping up, you get to volume, but volume isn't necessarily the maximum amount of wafers you can push through. It's just like it's a certain level of volume. And every company has their own definition of what volume means as opposed to test production. But then you get to this, you're kind of hitting your stride. And when you've hit your stride, the gross margins improve. So it's not well understood, and it's quite counterintuitive, but the newest node is often the most unprofitable node. Even though it's priced really high, we're talking like $30,000 a wafer now at some points. That's actually, the gross margin of that can be quite low because of all the time and energy it takes to push it through. Capacity utilization might be high, but yield might be low. And it's just a very difficult process. But then once it starts to mature, that gross margin for that leading node crosses over the corporate level. And that's happening now with the N3 node. It's crossing over into the corporate level. So it drags down gross margins, and then it comes somewhat matured, and then it crosses over the other side and starts dragging the margins upwards. So that's what we saw with the gross margins. When the gross margin expands, it kind of tells you how well they're doing in terms of just getting the efficiency going on that new node. And that's really important because it also means you can get more wafers through, more good dies through, and more chips out to the final client. So gross margin's a big one they're looking at. The other one was CapEx.
This quarter.
Well,
month over month, right? Or
quarter over quarter, the amount they spent was actually slightly less than 4Q, which is a bit counterintuitive. And that's because, they've got to get the equipment in, they've got to install it, all those things. But what's interesting is they didn't raise their CapEx guidance for the year.
Right.
And I think a lot of people were disappointed because it means they're not planning to install necessarily any more capacity than they'd planned to install 3 months prior. And some people are disappointed, they're not doing enough, they should be doing more, they should be spending more money, building up the fabs quickly enough. TSMC is famously blamed for slowing down our AI future. All of that is true, but in their defense, it's not totally in their control. ASML can only churn out so many EUV equipment pieces a year or a quarter or a month. That's constrained. Building a factory shell is constrained. kitting out a clean room is constrained. Plugging in utilities is constrained. All of these things are constrained. It's not just TSMC. And so they've got to get all of these disparate parts of the puzzle together, down to things like what's constrained TSMC over the last few years is environmental compliance for a new factory in a new part of Taiwan. And they've got to go through the environmental process of getting it ticked off by the environmental authorities.
There's like that new lot in Tainan that's constrained because there's like a bird or something, an endangered bird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was an expansion in northern Taiwan, I think it was Hsinchu Taoyuan, that was slowed down for a while because there was a very important temple.
Right. You can't move that temple, right?
Yeah, and they needed to move the temple and move the gods with it, right? So...
Are these bird gods?
They're all birds. So there is definitely a sense of disappointment that they didn't raise CapEx.
Right.
And I can understand why. They also didn't really raise their revenue guidance. Now, to be fair, they raised their CapEx guidance by saying it's the upper end of our previously stated range.
Yep.
I don't take that as a CapEx raise. It's just narrowing. The other one is revenue was basically not raised. It was kind of, again, to the upper end of what they'd previously said. And a lot of people were disappointed with that. But I think in both CapEx and revenue, it's reasonable for them to not raise either of them because of what's going on in the Middle East right now, which has a lot of impacts, could have a lot of impacts on TSMC. One is the supply of materials, helium, argon, hydrogen, all sorts of materials that they need. They say that they're fine, they're going to be okay, they've got enough reserves of materials. And I trust them, I think they probably do at this stage. But the other one is when you have anything like a war, that can impact the global macroeconomic environment. People just don't want to spend money, or they're not spending money. It can have an impact on the economy. And so there's not a lot of upside for TSMC to raise revenue now in the midst of all this uncertainty, only to 3 months later say, oops, we've changed our mind. It's back to where we were before. Instead, it's better for them to wait it out, wait to the next round of earnings and outlook, which would be mid-July, and then say, all right, yeah, we're going to raise or cut. I don't think they'll cut, but, then we'll raise then. And same with CapEx. But with CapEx, even if they had more money to spend or were willing to spend more money, they still have to depend on their suppliers to be able to deliver that equipment. And that may not be as easy. So there's a certain sense of disappointment that they didn't raise, but I think it's understandable why.
I have a running game I've been playing for the last couple of years. Where is the N2 wafer? Where are the N2 wafers coming from? I was at Kaohsiung a couple of weeks ago, and I got to see the fab over there. You have to climb a mountain and then look down at it. It's going. There's people coming in and out. It's fully staffed. Where are the N2 wafers?
Well, the N2 wafers are coming out, right?
But this year, NVIDIA is doing Vera Rubin, which is an N3 wafer, N3 wafer. I guess the only possible user would be Apple, but then we don't get an iPhone until September, which is many, many months from now.
It's my understanding that the next iPhone chip was already in production towards the end of Q4 2025, which sounds early, but if you've got the design locked in, which they kind of had, you might as well get producing early because you've got to go through the process. At the leading edges, such as N2, N3, N5, N7, the process of making a chip gets extended. It can take longer. Packaging is also an issue. Packaging for an iPhone chip is easier than an AI chip, but there's some challenges. So it's then got to come out of the front-end fabrication, get packaged, and then go out to Foxconn or Pegatron, for the whole building into a module. And so that's already been underway. So that's, Apple has been getting those chips off the press. And also, I think some of the Mac chips as well will be at N2. So they are happening. And there'll be more N2 wafers coming out this year, of course. This is kind of the N2 year.
It'll be exciting to see them. I'll be looking forward to them. One of the things that they talked about that you highlighted was that they are expanding capacity in N3. It's like a 4-year-old node, and they're actually adding capacity. Is that weird?
It's a little bit weird. It's kind of become one of these super nodes for them. A bit like the last one I can think of is 28 nan, which was a long time ago. But 28 nanometer was an absolute gangbuster of a node for the whole industry.
Still does 5% of their revenue, right?
Yeah. And it's only 5% of TSMC's revenue. But 5% of TSMC's revenue is more than many companies have in total revenue. They actually have, TSMC has more 28 NAND capacity than anyone else on the planet.
Right.
Which is weird, but that's just because they're so huge. They're doing a run rate of around 15 million wafers a year. Nobody else comes close. So when it's only 5%, and remember the price is lower, which means the percentage of actual capacity will be higher. And that means that 28 still is a killer node. So 3 is somewhat of a killer node. A lot of companies have built around it, designed around it, and it works for them. And it's not just the 3 NAND at the front end, but also then you've got to shove that out, package HBM with it, and then put it on a CoWoS packaging substrate. So you can understand why customers don't necessarily want to jump to N2 yet if they've already designed around N3 and the whole kind of ecosystem is around N3. There's definitely advantages to N2, but these kind of trade-offs, as we know, the cost of moving to every extra node is getting more and more expensive. And a few years ago, we kind of bottomed out of the price per transistor. One of the things that Morris Chang spoke about decades ago was, thanks to Moore's law, the cost per transistor just keeps dropping and dropping and dropping.
Right.
We actually seem to have got to the bottom of that curve, and now the cost per transistor is kind of slowly inching up again, or at least flattened out. Right. So staying at N3, it makes sense for a lot of companies.
Gelsinger says that that's the money that you're paying to ASML. That's ASML's money right there. 7%. They did 7% of the rev in Q1 to 28 nanometer. That's like $2 billion or something.
That's a lot of money.
That's like Global Foundries size.
Yeah.
That's kind of crazy. It's like a node that nobody cares about. It's like a 20-year-old node, and it's massive.
Nobody cared about it until the automakers found themselves short of chips 5 years ago, and they're like, oh, we really care about it.
I think they're 130 nanometer.
Yeah.
My favorite one is that, like, the 250 nanometer jumped up from 0% to 1%.
The 0.25 micron, which is, 100 times bigger than what a 3 nano, or 1,000 times bigger than a 3 nano. It went from 0 to 1%. Now, it's a rounding error. Like, it's literally, it could be 0.5 and it got rounded up to 1%. But it went from 0 to 1%. It's suddenly someone decided to order that, like, trailing edge 30-year-old node for what I don't know, but I'd love to know who that customer is.
Like $200 million of rev or something like that.
Just from 0 to something.
And he was like, I need that. He's like, I don't need the 3 nanometer node. I don't need that AI stuff. I need this.
It might be like the last. It may be the last gasp, because speaking of expanding, TSMC, and they talked about that during their the earnings conference call recently, was that they're repurposing a couple of old fabs. They've got a 6-inch fab and an 8-inch fab, and now we're in 12-inch. So 8-inch was kind of old more than a decade ago.
Right.
They're actually repurposing them for N3 and N2, for leading edge. They didn't say specifically which leading edge, but they're repurposing them for leading edge. That's how desperate they are. And that's a very unusual change to TSMC's business model. When TSMC has a new node, which they do approximately every 2 years, they don't go back, shut down a factory and retool it. They just build a new factory.
Right.
That's always been the way. That's why they've gone from like 1 or 2 fabs to now 20-something fabs around the world. Because new node, okay, we just build a new fab. But this time they're so desperate, they're getting an old fab and saying, we're going to repurpose it. And that's really an unusual choice for TSMC.
But like someone driven me around Hsinchu, right, to look at all the fabs, like Fab 2, Fab 5, all these, the numbers make no sense. But like the 6 to 8 inch wafer fabs, like that Acer TI fab, right? Weird structure, not that big, right? How much capacity can you get with that?
In the tens of thousands of wafers a month, which is not a lot when that's like a rounding error for TSMC. But there could be some small esoteric reason for that. Like there could be some use case for that specific size. All the designs, the masks, the tooling is everything for that 6-inch. And it's kind of like the story of like nuclear power plants are run on like COBOL that was written 50 years ago, and nobody's going to update it because they're worried it'll crash. And so somebody's designed something around a 6-inch design and a mask and everything. And they're like, why? This is fine. Why would I upgrade? And now TSMC is like, well, you have to. But, somebody else is running a 6-inch fab, so you go to them.
You can go to Vanguard or something. Like, what is They also, one of my favorite things is that in your newsletter, you have a picture of Dresden, the Dresden fab. That fab basically has been forgotten.
It's been forgotten because it's not running yet. So.
Not running, but it's like they're kind of forgetting that it's like they're building and they said that it's not going to be done. It's like technically on track. It's not running until like 2028 or something.
Right, which is kind of quick. It's only 2 years away. But at this stage, like Arizona's running and they're expanding and expanding and expanding. And Kumamoto's running and doing somewhat quite well. And they've brought forward their N2
N3
plan, N3, and they'll be doing N2 in future. N2 at Japan, not yet, in a few years, but they're speeding up the uptake of the newer nodes overseas, right? Usually it was going to be a few years behind, and that gap between Taiwan and overseas will be shortened. And so then we think, well, Dresden's still 2 years away, but that's not so slow, actually. It's just that it looks slow because everything else is just speeding up.
Do you think they're going to upgrade the node? It's like 16 nanometer node, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think the thing about Dresden is they've got, German companies they've got skin in the game, and Dresden is very much built for German industry, European industry, car companies and so forth. And so if say Bosch or any of the suppliers to the car industry decide that they're suddenly going to design a chip at 3 nan or 2 nan, then great, TSMC will do it if they can get the tooling. But it really comes down to, do the clients need that? Do the clients want that? Or, and this is the kind of decision TSMC's CEO will have to make, is if it's not getting the traction and not getting filled up as much as they think, maybe CC Wei sees the shell and the amount of land they've got and says, well, we need more N3 or N2. Might as well just shove some N3 or N2 there because we really need that capacity. Okay, we're not going to sell it to the Europeans. Jensen Huang will take that. But, hey, we need capacity, and we've already got the foundations and the structure of a fab there anyway, so we might as well just upgrade that to the leading edge, even though it's not actually for the Europeans. That might be a decision he has to make.
Right. One of the things that I remember listening to a TSMC customer on a pod, he basically said that TSMC really cares about diversification of their customer base. They really care about that. I've heard some things that like TSMC only dedicates 20-30% of their total capacity to NVIDIA alone. And I guess the instinctual thing is like, oh, why don't you just raise that? But that means that kicking someone out, it means someone doesn't get to make a product. Also, they don't want NVIDIA to have too much capacity at a point in time. It's very fascinating to kind of look at that sort of dynamic and see whether or not they just do decide to make allocation decision. And they never talk about it. Nobody knows how they...
Well, Ben and David at Acquired have this term, communist capitalism. I think they apply it to like the NFL and somewhat to F1. It's kind of the same thing. Like CC Wei and before him Mark Liu and before him, Morris Chang, they have to make these decisions like, we want to treat everyone equally. Well, some small company that's only buying 5,000 wafers a month is nowhere near going to be as equal, and they shouldn't be treated equally to Apple. But you've got to treat them somewhat equitably and fairly because, yes, you want to make sure that you, as a supplier, are not reliant too much on one customer. But you want to make sure those customers have a viable supply of product that can go into their products so they can sell. Because you don't want to be the company responsible for your client going bankrupt or delaying a product, which happened before. Like they had a mess up with Qualcomm many years ago. I think it was a 28 nanometer node, and it delayed by, I think, a quarter or so. And Qualcomm couldn't get their chip out, which meant that the cell phone makers couldn't get their Snapdragons. It had a ripple effect right through the supply chain where a year and a half from the time the problem happened, the smartphone couldn't be released. That's a problem that TSMC doesn't want to have to deal with.
Last thing you want to talk about.
Yeah, well, TSMC doesn't make DRAM.
Samsung does.
Samsung does, and they also do foundry work. There you go. By the way, I should point out, people say, well, why don't they just switch more of their foundry to DRAM? They're very different types of fabs. You can't just get the logic foundry stuff and shove it into DRAM and vice versa. You can't really do that.
They descended from the same tree, that's the great thing about semiconductors. They kind of descended from a single progenitor chip.
Yeah.
But the logic and memory nodes have diverged.
It's gone in very different directions.
Like whales and hippos.
Yeah.
Very strange.
Yeah, I mean, a whale is not an elephant, right? But they're both mammals. So TSMC doesn't make DRAM. Let's just put that out there. They do specialty RAM, though.
No, wait, they do?
Yeah, no, TSMC has a whole team doing all sorts of specialty RAMs, like SRAM and other stuff, which is, packaged into the die or the chip for the clients. It's not like they're just shelling out standalone SRAM. It will usually go into some of the product.
They do MRAM too, embedded stuff.
Yeah, so
stuff.
embedded types of RAM, various flavors of RAM. So TSMC does have a RAM business. But what's interesting, and I think this could be one of the stories that plays out through 2026, is because of the rise of the price of DRAM and the shortage of DRAM, we are starting to see the term that CC Wei uses, softness. We're seeing some softness in the PC industry and also the smartphone industry because smartphones do need DRAM. And there's two issues here. One is price, but one is cost. And I think it will impact probably not Samsung branded phones. I would be guessing that Samsung's going to make sure that Samsung gets enough DRAM. But I think we will see it in things like a Xiaomi and the Oppo Vivos, those lower price ones. Now, Xiaomi does high price phones, they also do low price phones. I think what will end up happening is the low priced smartphones will get hit worse because if you're getting DRAM into your phone and you've got a somewhat high-end CPU going in like a MediaTek or a Qualcomm and you're coupling it with high-priced DRAM, well, that's just going to have to be a high-priced phone. But there's not as much margin in a low-priced phone to pay more for DRAM. And so, do a low-priced phone with, low-spec screen, low-spec storage, all the low specs across the bill of materials. But then your DRAM is really expensive, and there's nothing you can do about that.
Right.
You've got to bump up the price. And a consumer's going to go, well, I've got this terrible CPU, terrible screen, low battery life, all of the things are terrible, but I've still got to pay kind of a high price. Well, forget about it. So I think what we'll see this year is the smartphone makers, they are going to make phones, they will have to go premium, and that will mean lower volumes. And as a result of lower volumes, TSMC will probably make fewer chips, fewer wafers will go through TSMC's factories for smartphones purely because of something that's in a factory somewhere else to do something else, which is DRAM. And the same thing with PCs, right? PCs need a set amount of DRAM. There's not a lot of room to play with how much DRAM you put in a PC because you're coupling with an AMD or an Intel CPU. You can't really de-spec a desktop or a laptop computer because, DRAM's too expensive. And so, again, if you're a Dell or an HP or a Lenovo and you've got to pay all that money for your bill of materials, you're probably going to put it to a higher priced product, and that will be lower volume. And the cheaper one, you just won't have as much volume, which means back to the issue on TSMC's side, they won't produce as many chips. AMD, for example, may not sell as many PC chips. And they may be cool with that because they're all in on AI. But there's a lot of other chips that go into a computer that are not a CPU, like all the controller chips and all the other stuff. So that'll have a ripple effect this year, I think. And so the DRAM problem, indirectly, kind of second, third order effect, could mean that what we see from the smartphone sector and possibly even the consumer electronics sector at TSMC will be slower this year, which means it has to push more into the AI side.
I read a stat from a newsletter from a friend of ours who basically said that Xiaomi's shipments of smartphones have declined something like 20 to 30%.
Yeah, we've already seen it.
Yeah.
I think
Xiaomi's fine with it because they make cars now. They're a car company. But, I mean, it's a kind of a big deal. I guess it'll hit kind of the smartphone makers like Oppo and all that.
I think it really will.
Hit MTK maybe.
I think I'm already hearing that MediaTek MTK is suffering at the smartphone level for that very reason. But I'm also hearing that MediaTek is going deeper into AI. Edge AI would definitely be a MediaTek thing, right? But it's not like you can just wake up one morning and decide you're going to do it. You've got to work with the supply chain. You've got to work with NVIDIA and everybody else to make that happen.
That's why this pod's called supply chain. You have to work on the supply chain.
It's exactly what it's about. It's a big problem.
You've been listening to Supply Chain. I hope it was quite fun. Signing off, this is John from Asianometry.
I'm Tim Culpin from Culpium.